Chapter 7. I liked New England. The quaint village shoppies, the neat little houses with pristine picket fences, the polite repartee between local folk. So I decided to stay. When I was fired from the summer theater, I was also evicted from the concentration camp they called staff housing, so my first order of business was to find a place to live. You would think a tidy single lady with no pets and a passion for les beaux mots would have no problem. But alas, the polite New England folk had their share of bias when it came to artistes. As I mentioned, I had taken up tap dancing shortly before leaving off-Broadway, and I required a home where other residents would not mind several short periods of rhythmic practice. Finally, I managed to procure just the right ground-floor apartment in the house of one Mrs. Etta Mendelssohn, a severely anorexic wisp of a woman who was in need of grounding and could not hear. Our mutually compatible disabilities, my weight, her deafness, worked quite well for both of us, until the fire. The problem began with baseball. Although I have never watched a whole game, I feel entitled to my opinion. And my opinion is that baseball is a puerile pastime practiced by overpaid boys who would do better to cut to the chase and sell insurance. However, despite its inanity, baseball does have one of the preeminent anthems of athletics, namely, "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," with its perfect tempo for the practice of slow-motion shuffle ball changes. I don't mind saying that following my termination as prop mistress of the small summer theater, I fell into a state of ennui. To be honest, ennui does not do justice to my emotional abyss. By the end of my first week at Mrs. Mendelssohn's, I was in need of antidepressant medications. Unfortunately, such aids did not fit into the budget of an unemployed artiste, so as an alternative, I decided to activate my endorphins with 20 minutes of slow-motion waltz clog. As accompaniment, I put on the aforementioned recording, and I'm amazed to admit that until that moment I had never seriously considered the gravitas of the lyrics. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack. I don't care if I never come back. I ask you, dear reader, to contemplate these words, and perhaps you will understand how they sounded to a desperately hungry person who had not only lost her job, but her option to go back to New York City due to a nasty eviction from her off-Broadway apartment, an event I fear I have forgotten to mention. You see, in a fit of hunger-induced bad judgment, whilst completely out of cash after being blackballed by my temp secretarial agency due to a misunderstanding about borrowed office supplies, I seem to have swiped one yellow, delicious apple from my former place of employ, the nasty neighborhood Korean market. To make a somewhat dreary epic short, my bail and the exorbitant fine rendered me incapable of paying rent, and it was in this penniless state that I fled New England and my fleeting job as a prop mistress to the Jewish homosexual of questionable mental health. With this background, I'm sure you can relate to my feelings waltz clogging to a song about happy people enjoying the company of others while eating caramel-covered snacks, when I was reduced to eating chicken of the sea in a one-room hovel owned by a deaf woman with a bird. Well, it threw me into a depression I scarcely know how to describe. So when I suddenly heard Mrs. Mendelssohn's bird yelling, "Let me out! Let me out!" I don't have to tell you, I could relate. I've never understood the infantilizing of animals, and even worse, the incarceration of one that is meant to be flying amongst the tree tops eating bugs. So when I heard Barnard, Mrs. Mendelssohn named the creature after her late husband, whose voice the bird apparently mimicked perfectly, although being deaf and near death from anorexia, which I admit I aspired to, but I lacked the discipline. How could the old woman have known? But I digress. When Barnard screamed, "Let me out!" I simply could not deny him. Mrs. Mendelssohn was doing errands in town and had left the poor creature in an 8-by-5-foot prison. My only intention when I headed up the impossibly rickety steps to the second floor was to allow the animal the modicum of freedom Mrs. Mendelssohn herself permitted him when she was at home. I let myself in with a bobby pin, an invaluable talent alluded to earlier that I seem to have been born with, and to say I was appalled is an understatement. In my opinion, sloppy people should not be allowed to have pets, and certainly not birds who would never choose to live in such conditions. Have you ever seen a sloppy forest? I looked through several of Mrs. M's magazines, 10 years or older. I believe the term is hoarding. Then I made my way around the stacks of boxes and piles of unlaundered undergarments to the bedroom where Barnard was imprisoned. "Let me out, fatty!" he bellowed in the late Mr. Mendelssohn's thick Bronx accent. Despite my enjoyment of winged creatures in nature, and I do love those public television specials, I was rather unnerved by the sight of this flapping red cauldron of fury glaring at me with vicious yellow eyes and addressing me so rudely. As I mentioned, fear seems to affect my motor skills, and to make matters worse, I was wearing my patent leather Mary Jane tap shoes whose soles were particularly slick due to my lack of recent practice. As I leaned forward over the mountain of rags and boxes that surrounded the cage, I seemed to have lost my footing. At which point, the brute screamed, "Fatty, fatty, fatty!" further disorienting me. And as I and the cage toppled toward the window, my only thought was to avoid shattering the glass, which is why I grabbed for the nearest source of support. A floor-sized halogen lamp, switched on in order to keep the room tropically warm, Mrs. Mendelssohn later explained to the fire department. As a formerly homeless person myself, I deeply regret my actions that led to the incineration of the overstuffed hovel Mrs. Mendelssohn called home, and I wrote a statement to that effect and accepted a lien on all future earnings. But between you and me, there is one thing I do not have the least remorse about. As I crawled through the flames on my stomach, I saw Barnard. It seems that the crash unlocked his cage, and as he flew through the shattered window, I swear he winked at me. Needless to say, my reputation was soiled in the small New England town, and the polite local folk dealt with it by shunning me. Icy smiles and speedy exits met my entreaties to converse and explain the situation. So, post-haste and pre-dawn, I vacated my emergency shelter at the crappy motel, not its real name, leaving an IOU along with an extremely apologetic note, and I used my remaining funds to purchase a bus ticket to the northern regions, where talk was minimal, housing much cheaper, and the main industries were snowmobiles and moose.